Imagine if Back Home Again in Indiana suddenly disappeared from the Indianapolis 500. Or if Take Me Out to the Ball Game vanished from the 7th inning stretch at Wrigley Field. That's the kind of situation Canada faced with what many call the country's second national anthem. And they had decades to make sure it never came to this. This is a story of how the sound of Saturday night hockey became a national ritual, and how one contract fractured a tradition that had felt untouchable. When Hockey Night in Canada made its television debut in 1952,
hello, Canada and hockey fans in the United States.
The telecast already had a theme. Canadian composer Howard Cable wrote a piece called The Saturday Game, which opened the program for more than a decade. By the late 1960s, the show's producers were looking for a new sound. Their solution was unexpected. They turned to a Vancouver-born jingle writer who had never even seen a professional hockey game. Her name was Dolores Clayman. She was writing advertising music in Toronto when McLaren Advertising hired her to create a new intro for CBC's Hockey Night in Canada. The producers weren't expecting a national anthem. They thought the music might open the show for a few seasons at most. No one imagined it would still be playing 40 years later. One afternoon, Dolores sat down at the grand piano in her home overlooking Lake Ontario. As the water shimmered in the distance, she wasn't picturing frozen ponds or backyard hockey games. She was imagining Roman gladiators on skates. As she struck the first notes, a B-flat rising to a C, the melody came almost instantly, and the hockey theme was born. The first reaction wasn't great. When the early demo was played on a piano for Ralph Mellanby and a number of big-name corporate sponsors, it didn't make much of an impression. But Mellanby, a young director on Hockey Night in Canada, heard something different. He imagined what the piece would sound like with full orchestration. After he convinced the sponsors to give it the green light, the CBC began using it on the program. When the theme debuted on Hockey Night in Canada, viewers had no idea they were hearing something that would become one of the most recognizable sounds in Canadian sports. For her work, Dolores Clayman was paid a one-time fee for the composition, $800. For the CBC, it was a routine production expense. For Dolores, it was just another jingle. In television production, that wasn't unusual. It was a straightforward fee for service. What they did not receive was ownership of the music itself. In the moment, no one at the CBC seemed overly concerned about that detail. But that detail would eventually become the entire story. Meanwhile, something else was happening quietly in the background. In the early 1980s, Clayman signed with an agent who began renegotiating how the music was licensed. The CBC could continue using it, but now the network would pay a fee each time it aired. With every broadcast, the value of it grew. But that value wasn't building inside the CBC. It was accumulating somewhere else, with the copyright holder who still controlled the music. By then, the melody had become essential to the broadcast itself. Losing it would no longer be a minor inconvenience. It would be unthinkable. The network believed the situation was settled. But what it had actually done was build a national tradition on top of a contract it didn't control. By the 1970s and 80s, Saturday night hockey had become something more than a television program. In a country that stretches across 6 time zones, very few things happen simultaneously from coast to coast. NHL hockey was one of them, and those opening notes didn't simply introduce a show, they announced a game. Week after week throughout the hockey season, the same pattern played out in millions of living rooms. The music hit, the show opened, and everyday life gave way to game night. Over time, the song stopped feeling like part of a television program and started feeling like part of the night itself. The CBC reinforced that connection. They used the music everywhere. Promos, commercials, and highlight packages. It wasn't just opening the broadcast. It was woven into the identity of Hockey Night in Canada until the two became inseparable. And in a country where hockey already sits close to the center of the culture, that repetition turned a piece of television music into something much bigger. Inside the fine print, however, the balance of power was shifting. The CBC had trained an entire country to believe the song belonged to the network. By then, the price of control had risen significantly. As the 2000s began, an arrangement that had seemed harmless in 1968 was starting to look very different. At the CBC, executives believed the network had created the value. Without Hockey Night in Canada, they argued, it was just another television jingle. For decades, the CBC treated the theme as if it were part of the broadcast itself. But legally, it was still just a licensed piece of music, and that license was about to expire. From the viewpoint of the rights holders, the equation had changed entirely. Canada's public broadcaster was building enormous cultural and commercial value around a piece of music they still technically controlled. Clayman's agent understood something the CBC had slowly forgotten. Replacing that theme wasn't realistic. You don't replace a 40-year ritual and expect the audience to accept it. And that changed the tone of negotiations. Because once the other side knows you can't walk away, you're not negotiating from a position of strength. At that point, both sides understood exactly what was at stake. The CBC wasn't just discussing licensing terms, they were trying to secure control over something that had become foundational to their brand. The contract wasn't just legal language anymore, it was a ticking clock. In the spring of 2008, negotiations between the CBC and Dolores Clayman's representatives were reaching a breaking point. Scott Moore, head of CBC Sports at the time, put two offers on the table. One was a buyout, $850,000 Canadian for full ownership according to Clayman. The other was an extension of the existing agreement, which was paying her $65,000 a year. Both were rejected. From the CBC's perspective, it was a serious attempt to resolve the issue. Close to $1 million for a jingle written in 1968 was a substantial offer. Continuing the existing agreement would have kept the status quo intact. From the composer's side, the calculation looked different. There had already been years of tension between the two parties, including a $2.5 million lawsuit filed in 2004 over the use of the song in other programming and disputes over licensing rights in Canada. The relationship wasn't just about renewal terms anymore. It was about control, usage, and long-standing grievances. On June 5, 2008, the announcement became official. The CBC would no longer have the rights to use the Hockey Night in Canada theme song. Publicly, the CBC tried to downplay the loss. Executives suggested they had grown tired of the tune and were already considering a national competition to replace it. The reaction to the news was immediate. Talk radio lit up across the country. Newspapers ran headlines about the loss of the second national anthem. Fans flooded message boards asking how the CBC could have let this happen. Inside the CBC, attention turned to what would come next. The network launched a national contest, hoping to reset the ritual and move forward. But replacing the music that had opened the broadcast for a generation isn't like refreshing a logo. When Hockey Night in Canada returned with new music, viewers didn't hear a fresh start. They heard what was missing. But outside the CBC, the situation looked very different. Suddenly, the rights holders had options. What had started as a routine renewal had turned into a public rupture. This wasn't a quiet licensing lapse. It was a very public reminder of who actually controlled it. While the CBC was trying to explain how it had lost the theme, CTV saw an opportunity. If CTV secured the rights, it wouldn't just be acquiring a song, It would be acquiring a piece of Canadian television history. Then the story took another turn. Within days of the CBC losing the rights, rival network CTV struck a deal with Clayman's representatives, allegedly for her original asking price in the range of $2.5 to $3 million. Now the iconic theme was in the hands of a private broadcaster. And that changed the dynamic immediately. The CBC still had the Hockey Night in Canada name and the games, but the music cue that had opened the show was now controlled by a competitor. The CBC had treated the theme as if it were permanent. CTV treated it like an asset. And once that asset changed hands, so did the balance of power. What began as an $800 fee in 1968 ended with a rival network controlling the sound Canadians associated with Saturday night hockey. Hockey Night in Canada survived, but something fundamental had changed. For 40 years, those opening notes had meant the same thing across the country. The game was about to begin. Then, they were gone. The broadcast still aired, the team still played. But the sound Canadians had heard every Saturday night for a generation now belonged to someone else. For decades, the theme had felt permanent, but it had always been temporary, because the CBC didn't actually lose the music in 2008. They lost it the moment they decided to build a national tradition on something they didn't own.